John Watson wanted to show that humans can be classically conditioned, like what happened to Pavlov's dog. Watson and his team decided to prove that this could be done in humans by classically conditioning a 9-month-old baby named Albert using animals and scary noises. First, the researchers presented Albert with a fuzzy white rat. As he'd reach out to pet the animal, the psychologists would strike a hammer against a metal bar behind his head, creating a loud noise to startle him. Eventually, just the sight of the white rat was enough to make Albert start crying and crawl away. He'd begun to associate the fear of the loud, scary noise with the fuzzy white rat. So yeah, Albert had been conditioned. But this study failed in a lot of ways. Then, of course, there were the ethical issues. Watson never reconditioned Albert to not be afraid anymore, so he was permanently affected by the experiment and not in a good way. We also don't know if Albert's mother fully consented to the research, which definitely violates the main ethical principles of the Belmont Report. And this wasn't the only horrifying psychology experiment conducted on children in the early 20th century. In the late 1930s, a psychologist named Wendell Johnson and his graduate student Mary Tudor at the University of Iowa wanted to know how positive and negative feedback affected the way children learned language. They decided to test this directly by giving kids positive and negative feedback on speech disorders. That might not sound so bad, but there's a reason why their experiment is now known as the Monster Study. Tudor recruited 22 children from an orphanage, told them they'd be given speech therapy, and split them into 2 groups. 10 of these children, 5 in each group, had early signs of stutters, but both groups also included kids with normal speech patterns. The kids in one group were told that they didn't have a stutter. They were given positive feedback that they'd outgrow the speech difficulties and that they should ignore anyone who criticized the way they spoke. Meanwhile, those in the other group were told that they did have a stutter and that they should never speak unless they could do it right. As you can probably imagine, this didn't go very well. The encouragement and criticism didn't seem to have much of an effect on the children's stutters, but the different kinds of feedback did have a huge impact on their self-esteem. The kids with speech issues who got positive feedback didn't lose their stutters, but they did become a lot more confident when they spoke. Meanwhile, the children who were given negative feedback became more withdrawn, self-conscious, and frustrated, whether or not they actually had a stutter to begin with. So for that group of kids, this research was pretty damaging. As minors, they couldn't consent to the research, and the people who ran the orphanage didn't protect them from the potential harm of the study. The children also weren't debriefed after the project was over, and there was no real follow-up on how they may have been affected by the study long term. All of these things were later declared unethical by the Belmont Report.
The psychologists James Mitchell and Bruce Jessen have agreed to undisclosed terms with 2 victims and the families of a 3rd. It's the first time top officials in the CIA torture program are being held at least somewhat to account. Joining me is someone who has helped make this happen. John Kiriakou is a former CIA analyst who exposed the torture program and is the only official jailed in connection with it. John, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Mitchell and Jessen, the two CIA contractor psychologists who were the defendants in this case, were indemnified by the CIA in 2001. So even though they were sued, the CIA paid for their attorneys, the CIA is paying for the settlement, the CIA is paying for everything. And when I say the CIA is paying for it, I mean that you and I are paying for it. The American taxpayers are paying for it. So there's no actual hurt to Mitchell and Jessen. And third, you know, this trial, had it gone to trial, would have exposed CIA documents related to the torture program that we otherwise will never have access to. And we're going to lose that now. So whatever didn't come out with the Senate torture report and could have come out with this case will not come out. And we'll just never know what the truth is behind this case.
Let me start with who Mitchell and Jessen are. I mean, you talk about U.S. taxpayers paying their legal fees. Well, it wasn't just that, right? Because before that, to design this program, Mitchell and Jessen received millions of dollars to create the program. Can you talk about what they did and the techniques that they came up with that these victims were subjected to?
Yeah, Mitchell and Jessen were psychologists in the Department of the Air Force, and they reverse engineered the Air Force's SEER training program to use offensively against terrorism suspects. And so this became the torture program. This became the 10 techniques that were used that the Bush White House euphemistically called enhanced interrogation techniques. Now, in addition to being paid the standard, $1,050 a day that almost every CIA contractor is paid, Mitchell and Jessen, over the course of several years, were paid an additional $81 million to come up with this program and to then implement it. Now, what makes it even worse than just coming up with the program is that they went overseas to the secret prisons and they were the ones who actually carried out the torture. There will be no punishment for them for doing that.
Right. And let's talk about these victims, Suleiman Salim, Mohammed Ahmed Ben Sood, and the family of Gul Rahman. Rahman is now deceased. Let's talk about what they went through. I know that at least a few of them, Salim and Sood, I'm not familiar with Rahman's case, but they were held for years and ultimately ruled to pose no threat at all, as has been the case with so many of these victims of U.S. rendition and torture and imprisonment.
That's right. The two surviving victims of the CIA's torture program were tortured mercilessly and then released because they had nothing to do with terrorism. They were scooped up in the so-called fog of war. They were sent to Guantanamo. Before that, they were sent to secret prisons and they were tortured. It turns out they were the wrong guys. Gul Rahman is a particularly sad case. Gul Rahman was subjected to a torture technique called the cold cell, in which he was chained to an eye bolt in the ceiling like this. He was stripped naked. He was, his cell was chilled to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and then every hour a CIA officer would enter the cell and throw a bucket of ice water on him. Gul Rahman was killed with that technique. He didn't make it through the night and died of hypothermia. No one's ever been brought to justice for murdering Gul Rahman, and certainly the Justice Department never gave CIA officers permission to murder detainees during the course of their interrogations. Well, Gul Rahman's torture and death were overseen by Mitchell and Jessen. And again, there's no justice for Gul Rahman.
Right. So certainly Mitchell and Jessen had a real reason to not want this case to go to trial. Let me ask you, though, just to follow up on something you said before, in terms of documents that would have come out in a court case, not being able to now, is there not a second lawsuit that the ACLU also filed against Mitchell and Jessen? And if that's still ongoing, could that not possibly shed the light that has been foreclosed here?
Yeah, there's a second case pending, filed by the ACLU on behalf of, I believe, Abu Zubaydah. Now, Abu Zubaydah is far more controversial because he was sort of Mitchell and Jessen's guinea pig for this whole program. I'm sort of tied to Abu Zubaydah for life. I was responsible for his capture, when the CIA believed that Abu Zubaydah was the number 3 in al-Qaeda. He was never the number 3 in al-Qaeda, and in fact, he had never even joined al-Qaeda, but the intelligence was faulty. Well, he was tortured mercilessly, and he was the first one to undergo this torture. He has never faced any kind of justice. He's never met his accusers in a court of law. He's never faced a jury of his peers, and he's never even been charged with a crime. So not only was he tortured, but he's been held indefinitely and has literally no hope of release. So I hope that his case will eventually bring some of these atrocities to light. Now, the problem with Abu Zubaydah is that because he's so controversial and because he was the focus of the Senate torture report, I think the chances are very good that the CIA will invoke a national security defense and ask the judge to dismiss this case with prejudice before any testimony is heard.